Hello and welcome to The Steamy, the Scotsman's politics podcast. I'm Alistair Grant, the political editor of The Scotsman. It was the party's worst ever Holyrood election result. Last month, Anna Sawar led Scottish Labour into a humiliating defeat, returning just 17 MSPs. He had started the campaign talking about becoming Scotland's next First Minister, but by its end, all but the most delusional could see the writing on the wall. In Mr Sawar's defence, Scottish Labour was a victim of a national wave of disillusionment and unhappiness with the UK Labour government, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer in particular. But there's also been internal questions over the party's strategy in Scotland and over its uninspiring manifesto. But what happens now? It's no secret in Holyrood that Anna Sawar is widely expected to stand down in the coming months to allow a new leader to take the party forward. But who might they be, and what direction will they take the party in? These are big issues that the party will be forced to grapple with in the months and years ahead. And also, I think one of the important questions is whether there's still a future in which Labour, once a dominant political force in Scotland, could return to power. Well, to discuss all that and more, I'm joined by the Scotsman's Catriona Stewart and by Deputy Political Editor David Bol. Catriona, you've been writing a kind of piece for this weekend on this very issue. So I'll come to you first. What does the future hold for Scottish Labour?
Well, fundamentally, there are some big, meaty philosophical questions for Scottish Labour to try and resolve. What is the position of their relationship with UK Labour? Will there be any kind of movement towards a breakaway? They need to have a credible position on IndyRef 2 in a way of selling that. And then also just what the internal machinations of the party look like. And also some mustering of enthusiasm, because we're talking about a potential leadership race. When you speak to people in the party, some are saying that's going to come right after summer recess. Others are saying it'll be within a year, but it will be more towards the end of a year, which makes sense because there are local elections. What new party leader wants to take the party into local elections when there's a possibility that they're going to get another drubbing? There's a big situation down south that's had a huge impact on Scottish Labour. Do they want to wait and see whether there's going to be a new Prime Minister coming in? There are loads of moving parts, but there isn't particularly enthusiasm for a leadership race at the moment. For the names that are being bandied about, and we can maybe come back and talk about who those people are, there's, I would say, one who's enthused and others who feel obliged. And if you're running to lead your party out of a sense of obligation, I'm not really sure if that's the best way to do it, rather than having actual sort of enthusiasm and appetite for it. And certainly there's a feeling from some that anybody who takes over from Anna Sawar is going to be second tier. They're not going to be as good. So there are loads of moving parts to this situation at the moment, and a lot of dissenting voices and huge, huge questions for the party to try and resolve.
Yeah, I do want to come back and talk about runners and riders, but firstly, David, it's maybe worth touching on what went wrong for the party during the Holyrood election campaign. We've obviously spoken about the UK government's unpopularity. That's definitely a major factor in this. But there's also a sort of internal reckoning that I think needs to take place in Labour over its own strategy, its reliance on that relationship with the UK government up until it became a burden, and its kind of lack of an inspiring manifesto. I don't think anyone can really name off the top of their head a kind of key policy that Labour had in that manifesto.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's quite obvious to point to the UK government's problems and their unpopularity and blame them for Anna Sawar falling well short of what he told everyone he was going to be First Minister, and he just obviously has completely failed at that. But I've spoken to people on the Scottish Executive Committee, who's kind of the sort of powerful body at the top of Scottish Labour, who are quite annoyed at the strategy that was brought forward. It wasn't inspiring, as you said. They wanted to put forward a message that we would be more realistic than the SNP has been. They haven't followed through on those promises. But it was really up to Labour to bring forward something exciting, and they just failed to do that. They didn't enthuse people, didn't give people a reason to go out and vote for them. And ultimately, that is one of many reasons why it fell short. The strategy as well was to target all these constituencies, more than 30 of them, which if you looked at the polls, everyone kind of knew wasn't going to happen. But Labour, obviously ahead of polling day, didn't want to admit that actually we were not going to win as many seats as we promised, and we should focus on list vote, and it was left too late, and it just made a really bad night even worse by that kind of misjudgment, and failing and refusing to kind of be upfront about where the party was. So it is fair to say that Anna Sawar and his team haven't really taken responsibility for any of it. Nothing's really been said about what went wrong. It's all been, well, Westminster made it very difficult for us and I'm going to carry on. But for a lot of people in the party, that's just not really good enough. And as Kat mentioned, who would want to kind of take on this job at a time when Scottish Labour is in a bit of a disaster? It does feel like a bit of a poison chalice, and that will make it harder when Anna Sawar does decide he's going to step down, because it really does feel like it's a matter of when rather than if. I know he's insisted that he'll carry on and he wants to be a Glasgow MSP for the whole term, but it's very hard to see how he does that, having led Scottish Labour not into just one disastrous election, but two. Granted, the first one, he didn't have a lot of time to turn things around, but he has lost 2 elections, including this one where he told everyone he was going to be First Minister.
Yeah, there were some mad moments during that election campaign where I think everyone could see the disaster approaching Labour, and you still had internal figures sort of saying that the strategy was still in place, they still had a chance, there was still a route to Butte House. It just seems quite, as I say, mad looking back. But Catriona, I mean, who are some of the runners and riders here? I mean, everyone always talks about Michael Mara as a kind of key figure that's going to come in and replace Anna Sawar. And he's someone who's very, very close to Anna Sawar, it should be said as well.
So I think Anna Sawar would endorse Michael Mara, and certainly he is first out of the traps. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of movement going on with him building a campaign and making it very clear that he wants to run as Scottish Labour leader. And there's some briefing going around that he will be uncontested, that this will be a coronation. And I don't think it's that simple. So one of the other names that's being bandied around is Paul Sweeney. And I chaired an event recently. Paul Sweeney was in the panel, so I took the opportunity to ask him in front of an audience whether or not he planned to run as Scottish Labour leader. And he said emphatically no. But I think he's potentially persuadable. Daniel Johnson is another name who is, I think, taking a never say never approach. So he's not publicly saying that he wants it. I'm not really sure if he knows whether he wants it. But I think if there was enough support for him, he could certainly look at throwing his name into the hat. There's also Joe Fagan is another name that's being bandied around. I think he might be a little bit of a wild card suggestion, because I'm not sure he has the public profile that a new Scottish Labour leader would need. But certainly there are people in the party who are mentioning his name. But one of the other wildcard suggestions is, as David mentioned, there is a possibility that Anna Sawar will throw in the towel completely and leave Holyrood and not see out his term as an MSP. And the next name on the list after him is Monica Lennon. Certainly if Monica Lennon comes back, all the suggestion is that she would want to challenge for the leadership. And there are people who are quite sceptical about Michael Mara. They're not entirely sure that he's the right man to lead the party. They say that he doesn't have the popularity that's necessary, doesn't have the support that's necessary. And also, again, as David mentioned, one of the big criticisms of Scottish Labour's Holyrood campaign was their manifesto, that it wasn't energising enough, it wasn't exciting enough, it didn't have enough big ideas to capture the public imagination. Michael Mara was the man behind the manifesto. So there's a lot of questions around that situation. And some people say that if there is a leadership race, then it's not going to be Michael Mara. It would only be Michael Mara if it was a situation where there wasn't a challenger and it was a coronation. But again, the other names that are being mentioned very much are on the fence, are not really sure of what's coming next. And I think there is a lot of hope that actually the leadership race doesn't happen in the coming months, that it is a bit further down the line, not least, I think, because people need a bit of time to get their ducks in a row and grapple with all of these big questions that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I was personally kind of surprised at this chat that it could happen immediately after recess, because I wouldn't have thought someone would want to come in before those local elections and sort of have the same problem that Anna Sawar did, to kind of be associated with the problems of the past. But who knows? David, what are some of the big issues that a new leader would have to grapple with I mean, Catriona was obviously mentioning there Michael Mara, largely responsible for the manifesto. And I think one of the key problems that Labour has in Scotland is establishing this credible policy agenda that differentiates it enough from the SNP that they'll attract those kind of centre-left voters back to the party. And there's also this other question that, again, I think Catriona touched on at the beginning about sorting out the relationship with the UK Labour Party, what they want that relationship to look like, whether they want to have some kind of split. And I remember talking to people during or just after the election campaign about this, and one of the problems of that is obviously that even if you do have this kind of hard split with the UK party, it's the branding that is a problem here, because people see the branding they associate with the Labour Party. So you'd have to be talking about changing that. And I think that's a different question entirely. What do you think?
Yeah, I can't see Scottish Labour running under a new name. But you're right, it would have to be. Otherwise, it's just in name only. And Alistair obviously tried to distance himself from Keir Starmer, told him to quit, and it had absolutely no impact. So there have been attempts to distance Labour from the UK government, and well, people just don't see it. They just see it as the same brand, the same people, and they get blamed for the same policies that happen at Westminster. So that is a real key struggle for whoever takes on this job, because I don't know how you do that. And we have to bear in mind, I guess, the UK government's leadership could change in the next few months as well. So that obviously would add to that. I mean, Anna Sawar is very close to Andy Burnham, as we know, although we thought he was close to the Prime Minister. So a lot could change, and we'll just have to find out what happens. But I don't know what the answer is there from Scottish Labour to make that relationship more palatable, both within the Scottish Labour Party, because there's a lot of frustration with Westminster from MSPs and local activists, but also to the wider public, where they're not just tied to what the UK party does. And that has been the problem, not just in this election, but going back a long time for Scottish Labour. Some of the big problems are not easily solved, though. I mean, Anna Sawar got the party into position, albeit on the back of that kind of UK government proactive kind of vote. People wanted to vote for the UK government, and he was soaring high in the polls at Holyrood. It just didn't last, obviously, but no one has really done that since the SNP had their grip on power in Scotland. And that was kind of seen as a missed opportunity. And for someone to come in and try and match that, especially time it right at an election, just seems impossible at the moment. The Constitution is another tricky one that Scottish Labour has failed since the referendum to have a position that the public really chime with. They're either seen as not strong enough on the union, or kind of sitting on the sidelines and letting everyone else fight about it. But that, as much as some people would like to, that story is not going away. People are still enthused about the Constitution. Maybe they don't want an immediate referendum right now, but people are still talking about it. And as long as the SNP are in power, that won't go away. And it's not just for Labour. Kind of all the unionist parties have failed to kind of bring forward that sort of positive message for the union. And that is one that Labour should really be owning and have failed to do. So as well as all their manifesto policies not being up to scratch, I mean, people in the SCC were basically pointing the finger quite angrily at Michael Mara for not being ambitious enough and being too kind of boring with the manifesto. So he'll have a lot of questions to answer if he does come forward, as Kat said. I think the other two runners and riders we mentioned there, Paul Sweeney and Daniel Johnson, I can see them being a Scottish Labour leader, but I don't think they'd want it right now. I don't think anyone would, to be honest. But the timing and on all of this, both at a Scottish and UK level, is probably going to be quite important.
See, on the manifesto situation, though, I mean, there were good things in the Scottish Labour manifesto. Can I think of any of them off the top of my head? No, I can't. And that's kind of the point of the exercise. But they were really damned if they did and damned if they didn't with the manifesto. So the SNP went on this line around making promises and delivering them, which is why they brought up some of their greatest hits from over the years and kept mentioning those over and over again. But there was this pushback against populism and this pushback against simple solutions in an attempt to counter the rise of Reform UK. So I think if they had come out with an absolutely wild manifesto that made huge pledges, there would have been a lot of scepticism around deliverability and whether it was credible. So I think obviously they've tried to play it safe, but I'm not really sure that it would have gone any better for them had they tried to do something a bit wild. I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said about the Scottish Labour manifesto, and it doesn't do to be too simplistic about it.
No, I think that's absolutely fair enough, actually. I think that's completely true. I think the manifesto was written with the kind of mindset that, you know, if the UK Labour government was more popular and Keir Starmer was more popular, that's the manifesto they would have done. This kind of don't scare the horses, sensible, pragmatic manifesto that's very deliverable. And that's that would be their whole thing coming in. You know, we're not the SNP, we're going to have stable government in Scotland. And that's kind of the message they're doing, that Anna Sawar is the kind of natural First Minister, as he and Scottish Labour would see him. I just don't think that manifesto really worked in the circumstances in which they found themselves. And I think you had one of the key problems, that probably the only policy that people remember from that election was the SNP one on supermarket price cap. That's the kind of grabbed all the headlines, and fair enough, you can argue about whether it was at all deliverable or sensible or well thought through. But it did grab attention in a way that nothing in the Scottish Labour manifesto did. But having said that, I think you're also totally right that they were damned if they do and damned if they don't. I don't think the manifesto would have made a real difference to the kind of national narrative that was developing. But I'm curious, Catriona, has anyone you've spoken to mentioned whether they believe that change in leadership down south would make a difference? Whether Andy Burnham coming in, obviously we're recording this before the by-election, but whether Andy Burnham coming in would make a difference for Scottish Labour?
Yeah, as you can well imagine, that is a very divisive issue and people are really split on it. But there is enthusiasm for Andy Burnham. I mean, Paul Sweeney, who is one of the potential runners and riders, is close to Andy Burnham, close to Angela Rayner, has been down in Makerfield campaigning in the by-election there repeatedly over the past few weeks. And I think that would be quite an interesting dynamic if we ended up with those two chaps as leaders of UK Labour and Scottish Labour, respectively. I don't think there is a lot of appetite for stability for Keir Starmer remaining in position. I think there is this weird tension between a feeling that there is a need for some stability for the short term. So there are people who are saying they really want Anna Sawar to stay in place and they want these big issues that the party is grappling with that we've discussed dealt with under his leadership, and then someone fresh can come in and take that forward. But then there are some who just think, do you know what, we just need to rip it all up right now. And I think certainly in the MP group more, and, you know, it's easy for them to say because they're not the ones who are going to have to actually deal with the situation on the ground. But in the MP group, there does seem to be quite an appetite for change in Scotland and a push for a leadership contest rather than a coronation. So I think my sense on balance is that there is an appetite for change, that they do want to see a change in leadership down south before any kind of change up here. But again, there is no one general consensus on the issue, as with everything Scottish Labour, and that I think is one of the crux of their main problems.
And David, you mentioned the Constitution, the issue of the Constitution, Labour's relationship with the constitutional debate. This has been a problem for the party for a long time in terms of the differences of opinion actually within the party about this, but also how it establishes its message to the public in a country that is still very divided along constitutional lines, whether parties like it or not. Do you think that the next leader of Scottish Labour is going to have to sort of come up with an answer for this? And there's been lots of suggestions about potentially having some kind of convention or some kind of route map to when a future referendum could take place, set in stone, whether that would rely on polls being at a certain level for a certain length of time, or some kind of similar situation to the agreement that's in place in Northern Ireland, for example. What's your thoughts around this?
Yeah, it's not easy, is it? I mean, they've tried and failed and tried again and failed again. But I do think that kind of trigger point for a referendum would be a good thing. It shows that Labour aren't ruling it out. They understand that people want to have a vote, but it has to be at the right time. And for years, the UK government and Labour have just said, well, now's not the time. And that's all they've said on the issue. They've just not addressed it at all. I can't remember Anna Sawar really addressing the Constitution at all during the election, other than kind of pleading with SNP voters to vote for him, which seemed a bit rich, to be perfectly honest. So I think it would. I mean, Paul Sweeney came up with he's kind of mentioned that idea of like a trigger point, like they have in Northern Ireland, for when the conditions would be met for a referendum to be talked about and looked at officially through a mechanism. And that does make sense, but it's going to need the UK government to agree to this. And I guess it's going to depend who's in charge of the UK government, and it's just very complex because UK Labour have different people to please, and it's not been Scotland. If you look at what happened before the election and how Labour have been in government, it's not been to help Anna Sawal's chances. It's been to kind of hold on to lost voters that were flooding to reform in the north of England mostly. So you're going to need a UK government that is really on Labour's side and not want to be seen to be soft on the constitution, because they'll just get battered from the Tories and others that they don't care about protecting the union. So it's a really difficult position, but I do think they need to have a position on it that is distinct and is a Labour position that other parties don't have, and it is going to be legitimate and one that can hold. And I do think that trigger point, if it can work, would be a good starting point for that. But I don't think it's going to win voters particularly. It's not a vote winner, so it's a very difficult one to kind of bring forward. But it would help Labour both in the short and long term if they can get to a point where they have a unique position on the constitution that isn't just garbage.
Yeah, because they almost tried to body swerve it during the Holyrood campaign. Anytime I heard Anna Sawar asked about it directly, he would just say something along the lines of, not now, it's not a question for now, we'll deal with that later, we need to deal with the bread and butter issues. And I think, that's obviously correct. Voters do want credible positions on the bread and butter issues. They're worried about the economy, they're worried bizarrely about immigration. Sorry, I shouldn't have sounded so flippant there, but it was a top three issue during the election campaign, and he just didn't want to talk about it. But when you have the SNP trotting along very nicely and looking almost certain to get the largest party in Holyrood, you can't avoid that issue. You have to have something to say about it, and they just simply didn't. So David's right, they need to come up with an absolute copper bottom position on that issue for anyone who's going to take the party forward in any kind of meaningful way.
And Catriona, can you see a route back to power in Scotland for Labour, perhaps at the next Holyrood election? Do you think that's likely, or do you think the debate is so different now to what it was in the past that they'll struggle?
I would not like to make any sort of predictions about the next election, because God knows what's coming down the line. We've got 5 years, and who knows how the landscape is going to shift in that time. And I think they are going to continue to be buffered by so many outside forces, not least the situation at Westminster, but also Reform UK and what the party manages to do in Scotland, whether it beds in, because we've not really reflected on how Scottish Labour were affected by Reform UK during the Holyrood campaign. But will Reform UK establish itself as a credible force in Scotland? Will it falter over the next 5 years in Holyrood and peter out? How will its MSPs perform? Does the party even really care about Scotland? I'm not convinced that it actually does. And will it continue to put the resources in north of the border? These are all sort of external factors that Scottish Labour can't control. I certainly think they need the next 5 years to regroup and lick their wounds and work out what they are doing with themselves. Of course, there's a route back to, I'm not sure, power at the next election, but certainly a stronger performance. But how they get there is the huge question that it is not for me to come up with the answer to.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a difficult question to answer. But I mean, yeah, you touched on a point there that we haven't really discussed Reform UK. I mean, obviously, Scottish Labour, Reform UK are tied in second place in Holyrood, both on 17 MSPs. This is probably a discussion we can get into in a future podcast, but I think Reform UK sort of came into that election talking about how they were going to, shake up the establishment, take on the establishment in Scotland. And I think their performance so far in Holyrood has been quite muted. Certainly during First Minister's questions, when all the other parties, or the main parties anyway, were going on, and Peter Murrow, the SNP scandal, Reform were talking about their own issues like tax or kind of oil and gas. Obviously, big issues, but it seemed like they were kind of sidelined in this debate. I mean, it was sort of strange in a way. You'd have expected them to kind of go for the jugular. In a way, they just haven't so far in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, David, I guess what do you think of the question I asked Catriona about Labour's route back to power, and what do you think about this dynamic between Labour and Reform, who are both kind of battling it out to be the Holyrood's equivalent to the official opposition? Obviously, we don't have one, but the equivalent.
Yeah, I think Reform's lacklustre performance is the best thing that's happened to Labour in the last few months, to be honest, because it just makes them look like the only real true big opposition to the SNP. That might not be true, but Reform are struggling with the kind of semantics and how Holyrood works, and it's making Labour look a bit more competent than maybe we should give them credit for, given the election. A route back to power, I mean, it all depends once again on what the state of the SNP is. No one's really cracked that nut, and if they can't beat the SNP when their vote share was this low in this election and not even come close to it, then it's very difficult for Labour to forge a legitimate path to doing that, particularly if someone takes over and just carries on Anna Sarwar's work. It depends. They could maybe find someone who's got a different vision, but I do think they need to think again about how they approach this and not just hope people will be sick of the SNP and come flooding to Labour, because that kind of wishful thinking hasn't worked. I think it would take a kind of coalition with unionist parties to get there, but so many different things could happen between now and then, including the UK government changing. So there's still a route, but they need to give themselves a good position to actually have a fighting chance, and picking the right leader at the right time is going to be crucial to that. So that's the biggest thing they need to do. And it does seem mad that Anna Sarwar is even considering staying on, given what happened during the election campaign. In the old days, he would have gone by now, but he wants to put that stability in place, and maybe that was a good call, to be honest, because no one's really been talking about Labour since the election. We've all been focusing on Peter Murrell and Reform, so maybe it was a good shout, and maybe it will help them transition to whoever does take over from him eventually.
In the old days.
I know, I laughed at that. Oh, the old days.
I suppose everyone always says they plan to stay on, don't they? Just like a la Paul Sweeney, everyone always says that they don't want to run for the leadership, and then lo and behold, they launch a leadership campaign. But I'm sure we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months. We'll have plenty more to say about this. We've deliberately not touched on the by-elections because they will happen when this podcast is kind of coming out, but we will potentially do, I don't want to call it an emergency podcast. It's not an emergency podcast. We'll do potentially a podcast special on Friday morning talking about the Aberdeen South by-election, which is probably the more interesting one in Scotland. Certainly, it's become a sort of referendum on the future of the North Sea, the future of oil and gas. It's got that kind of that feeling that sometimes happens in by-elections when national issues get wrapped up into this local campaign. There's obviously the Makerfield by-election, which I'm sure we'll touch on at that point as well. But until then, thank you very much for listening. Please stay tuned to the Scotsman's website for all the latest news, comment, analysis, videos. Check out our YouTube channel as well. Subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe to the paper. Just throw money at the Scotsman is basically what we're asking. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.